Thank you, Lynn. I'm very pleased to be back in Montreal, and in particular back at the Atwater Library, which is a wonderful cultural resource for everybody and a place of some very fond memories for me. I'd like to acknowledge that we're here on the unceded territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe, and that Montreal, or Tiohtià:ke, continues to be the home of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We've come today to celebrate the publication of a new book by the Montreal writer Donna Nebenzahl. It's called To Linger With You, a memoir of sunshine and longing. And while on one level it's a memoir of an unusual childhood, it's also a lot more. Before Donna and I talk about the book, let me tell you a little about the author. Donna grew up in British Guiana, as you will hear, and she immigrated to Montreal at the age of 10. She attended high school in Pointe Claire before studying at Loyola College and McGill University. Eventually, she found what she calls her dream job in the newspaper industry, working as an editor, columnist, and feature writer at the Montreal Gazette and elsewhere. I can attest from personal experience that in a newsroom which had its fair share of talented cynics, she was an effervescent and very positive presence. Donna has retired from the daily grind of journalism, but she continues to be a part-time faculty member in the Department of Journalism at Concordia University. She's written one previous book, Womankind: Faces of Change Around the World, in collaboration with the photographer Nance Ackerman. She also conceived and wrote the script for the Quebec documentary Twice Upon a Garden, as well as the environmental blog Earthbound. Donna is a great traveler, a gardener, and now a yoga teacher. She and her husband Mark Swift divide their time between Montreal and Big Tancook Island off the coast of Nova Scotia. They have 2 children, and recently they became proud grandparents. Please welcome Percy's grandmother, Donna Nebenzahl. So, Donna, you do a wonderful job of setting the scene for readers, of helping us imagine the backdrop in which your childhood experiences unfolded. The first chapter in the book is called The House on Brickdam Street. Could you talk about this house and read a short passage from the book?
Yes, of course I can. This was the house where okay, louder. Okay, so I grew up with my grandparents in British Guiana, Georgetown, the capital city. And we were, there's a story of the Portuguese and coming from Madeira and settling. I was 5th generation there in British Guiana. And this was basically the place that I knew all my life until I was 10 years old. So I have incredible memories of it. And maybe people are surprised by I think if we sit with our memories, everything will come back to us. And I began to realize that I wanted to kind of make a house of those words, like recreate my family home. So growing up there was beautiful. It was the tropics. I was a happy child, and I didn't realize, of course, during that time what was happening in that country. I had no idea that British Guiana was looking for its independence, that where the population who lived there, including the Portuguese, who came as indentured labor, the country was basically full of people who had come from Africa, who had been taken as slaves, and from people who came from India, who came as indentured labor.
Donna.
Yes.
The house.
Oh, yes. Okay, so I'm going to read something which may which may help a little bit. Okay. Our childhood memories linger in the middle range, it is said, between the ages of 5 and 10. Mine glow and spark here, and maybe because of losses that I couldn't understand, I clung to home. That house was a presence in my tropical life, a sturdy sentinel as I played and dreamed through childhood. Inside, there was the comfort of its glossy mahogany floors, airy rooms, and tall casement windows, outside it stood resolute and welcoming. I never thought to look at it straight on, study it, but I would be aware of it above me when we backed out of the carport under the house with grandfather at the wheel of his British Vauxhall. Other times, sitting side saddle on the back of the bicycle as Auntie Olga ferried me to and from school, I would see it looming larger as we approached, so lofty and white, the front yard filled with trees and flowering bushes and Granny's favorite potted plants, as though it had sprouted from a base of leafy foliage, from a bower of green.
Thank you. So that's the house. Who else lived in the house apart from yourself and your grandparents, and who else lived nearby?
So we were a large extended family. There were 10 children, and my mother was one of them. So when my brother and I stayed there, lived there, there were only Granny and Grandfather, but we had cousins nearby who lived in the house behind us. My Uncle Clement, who was the oldest of the family. So the story is a typical immigrant story to some extent because the family began to emigrate to Canada. It began with my mother's sister, Thelma, Auntie Thelma, and slowly they came here. This was their place. This was where they found or wanted to find a new life. So although we were surrounded by all of this, of course, there was a big piece missing in this story, which was that my brother and I were brought up by our grandparents, but our parents were not with us. My mother had come to Canada, and my father had died when I was just a baby.
So where were you born?
I was born in Port of Spain, Trinidad. So the story gets as interesting as all of these stories do, which is that my mother and father who met in British Guyana, she of Portuguese descent, he of European descent.
We'll save him for later.
Oh, sorry. Yes. My father had a job in Trinidad, so my mother, protesting because my grandfather did not want her to leave home, went to Trinidad, and that's where I was born, in Port of Spain, a long time ago.
Let's just backtrack a little. Your grandfather, Frank Gomez, was the manager. Gomes, was the manager of a big department store in Georgetown, the capital. And your family was wealthy enough to have a cook and a nanny when you were very small. Yet you weren't part of the ruling elite. So can you just situate yourself and your family in Georgetown a little more?
Well, interestingly enough, the Portuguese who had come over, who had been lured there really because when slavery ended and the British could no longer use the slave population to grow the sugarcane, because this was a very fertile country. It was a beautiful country. And they, first of all, brought the Portuguese over. And so they stayed together. It's interesting. There is a woman who taught at the University of British Guyana who wrote a book, and she said that the Portuguese were an example of how well an immigrant group could stay together. They did everything. They had a rowing club, a tennis club, they had choirs, they had churches. So it's a kind of typical thing when you look around and see what immigrants do. Look at the Portuguese in Montreal. You see the areas of the city where people join together because joining together makes you safe. Joining together, having the rituals that you all practice, makes you feel at home. Anyway, so the Portuguese who came really to farm, because that's what they did in Madeira, which is where they came from, they started out on the sugarcane plantations, but when they worked off their indentured period, of a couple of years, they moved into the towns and they became merchants and shopkeepers. They were quite good at that. My grandfathers and my grandmother's mothers both owned, they called them rum shops in Georgetown. And so they bought property. They did all of those things to make life stable, and they became more and more comfortable. But at the same time, they were not the largest numbers of population in that country were Black and Indian who were brought from India. So the Portuguese, I think, were like maybe 8% of the population, but unusually for that small number, were really very successful.
Right. Let's talk about your mother for a bit, because you spent much of your childhood without your mother. Can you describe her, and also describe what your image was like of her when you were a little girl, when you were living with your grandparents and your brother and your cousins, but your mother wasn't there? How did that feel? What was your mother's absence like for you?
Well, I think children live in the present moment, and it wasn't a situation of spending time thinking about loss, because I didn't have any sense of loss. My mother wasn't there, and I knew she was somewhere, and I knew she loved me, and I knew that we were special because we were being brought up by our grandparents. But there was a sense of her as someone like, I don't know, an angel or a movie star. Somebody who was there but not there.
Well, she had movie star looks, didn't she?
She did. I want to read something if you don't mind. Could I? Okay. In that comfortable tropical house in Georgetown, I spent a childhood that was both privileged and empty. The story of the death of my young father just months after my birth, and the departure of my mother a few years later, crept into my consciousness quietly, furtively, despite the sense of family that I cultivated with such determination. In those early years, the people around me meant everything. When I did think of my mother, Gwen, on the occasion that she sent a gift or someone spoke of her, I imagined a princess or a movie star, dark-haired and red-lipped, beautiful and distant. I knew my brother and I loved her and she loved us, but even though I would light up inside when her name was mentioned, she seemed wrapped in silence.
And I think we can all tell just from that short passage how beautifully Donna writes, and how it's not easy to evoke, someone who hasn't, a period from many, many years ago, I won't say quite how long, and yet Donna does this tremendously successfully throughout the book. You and your family were devout Catholics.
Yes.
And you described going to church with your grandparents. Was your faith reflected in the schools that you attended and your brother attended?
Well, I went to a Ursuline convent school, and the Ursulines, as it turned out, were American. These were American nuns who had come there. I remember it being very benevolent, very. I had a big problem because it took me until I was maybe 7 or 8 years old to realize that I couldn't see. So I used to sit at the front of the class. I didn't realize that distance didn't do anything for me. There was nothing there. So I do remember there was one situation where I think because I couldn't see very well, or maybe because of what happened, what life was like around me, I did spend a lot of time reading and looking at books, and so I studied. I did well in school, and I had this one experience of when, for some reason, there was a big auditorium, although I'm sure it was probably as big as this room, but it was a big auditorium, and we had to go and stand in a certain place when the entire class was called forward one by one to stand somewhere at the end of the school year, and the person who came first had to go first. So I, unfortunately, came first in class, and I couldn't find the spot. Like I had to go to a stand somewhere, and I couldn't actually see it. And I remember that being, I should have been happy, but I was traumatized.
Yeah, it's terrible, the things that traumatize children, and grown-ups often have no idea. But your brother, he had a
Yes.
very different
Yeah,
experience
so my brother
school.
was sent to, we had a public school. I guess the Ursuline convent, you would call it a private school. My brother went to a public school where he, it was as simple as this, the difference. We used little workbooks to write things down. My brother had a slate with a, what was it called? A slate with a crayon? No, not a crayon, a chalk. So, and it was a rough place. It was, kids would be hit, for, now we're going back here. This is the 50s. But, and my brother it was so upsetting for him that he, in fact, played hooky. And the houses in South America were all high. The first floor, you could walk under it because we had monsoon rains, and so nothing was built on ground level. So there was a room at the back of the underneath of our house where my grandmother would have leftover furniture or whatever. Anyway, my brother hid there for 3 days because he didn't want to go, pretended he was going to school, and I'm pretty sure came home for lunch because we all did. But anyway, it was not a good time, for my poor brother. And I, again, this idea of children and how they experience life, I realized it wasn't a good thing when he was finally caught and the teacher came and my grandparents came, but we just carried on. There was no therapist to go to talk about this.
I think you do a terrific job of situating your childhood experiences in the context of this really unusual country, which is, as you just said, part of South America, but it was mainly English speaking rather than Spanish or Portuguese speaking. It faced the Caribbean. It was a British colony. So there were all these layers to it, all that have very rich texture.
Yes.
And you also do a wonderful job of describing some of the foods. I wasn't going to ask this, but I can't resist. Do you want to just pick one of the dishes you describe and talk about it?
Oh, okay. So
just one.
I guess there is a lot of, maybe because we were a big extended family, and my grandparents had a huge dining room with a big table, and many times there were people, my cousins would come and my uncle and aunt would come, and we'd all be sitting there. So maybe I should talk about garlic pork. So we would eat tropical foods, and they were not like, no one had ever ate roast beef or steak or we ate like what I still don't know whether they were kind of like leftovers, like oxtails and cow's feet and things that you'd have to cook for a really long time in order for them to be delicious, which of course they were. So, okay, I'll just mention pepper pot. So there was one dish that I've never actually been able to reproduce here. So it's made from the root of the cassava, which is a root vegetable, and it's like a molasses kind of stuff. It's called casreep. And you would use this to make the stew. And the stew was brown. It was very dark and it was delectable. It was amazing. But you'd have like a big chunk of fatty, what looked like a fatty meat sitting in the middle of it. And then you'd cut away the fat and the interior. I'm a vegetarian now, so I don't know why I'm salivating talking about this. But the interior meat was so beautiful and tender, and it had this smoky, gorgeous flavor. But anyway, the big deal was garlic pork, because every Christmas morning you would, this happens all over the Caribbean, you would have cuts of meat pork that you would steep in vinegar, fresh thyme, peppers, and lots of shredded garlic. And you'd leave it in a crock for maybe 4 or 5 days. And then you would take it out and cook it. You'd cook it in its liquid, and then you'd sear it so it would get very brown and crispy. And it would come to the table for breakfast on Christmas morning. This was the tradition, and in the old days, they used to drink, the grown-ups, we were told, would drink it with straight gin. And you'd all hang around together because you couldn't deal with anybody else after you'd eaten garlic pork.
Thank you, Donna. Notice, everyone, that I said limit yourself to
I
one dish.
I know, sorry.
So it's a good thing I didn't ask about the fruitcake. And before you say anything more, so here you are having this tropical childhood, which in some ways from the outside might seem almost idyllic. And yet, or rather, and then, you learned you would be leaving by ship for Canada. Were you excited at the prospect? Were you scared?
I don't think that I don't actually recall even being told that we were going. I think it just sort of became clear. Like we traveled once to Canada on board ship, which was a fantastic adventure, sort of when I was maybe 7 or 8 years old. And we always traveled on Saguenay, and they were freight ships. So they carried bauxite. They carried once, it was very exciting because they carried cows. And my brother and I had a wonderful time with the cows. And so we kind of knew what it was like to take that trip. This time, the big deal was that I remember very well, my little red coat. I had a little red coat that was made for me because no one bought clothes in stores. We had the dressmaker came, and which I thought I would be cozy and warm, and it turned out it wasn't for Canada at all. But anyway, so we came, and I knew that we were leaving because we were leaving with our grandparents, but there was this, I guess, something happened. There was a tension in me that I didn't articulate, and I got my first terrible headache. And I remember lying in the cot, in the bottom bunk. There were these big rooms in my grandparents' house, the boys' room, it was called, that had bunks in it, and the girls' room that had a big double bed in it. And I was lying there with a headache that I'd never experienced before. And Granny rubbed Vicks Vapor Rub on my forehead so it could burn so I didn't feel the headache. And everybody came and said goodbye to me. And I don't think I cried. I don't remember crying, but it was momentous. It was momentous.
Yeah, it must have been. And I'm sure it was eased by the fact that you were traveling with your grandparents. But they didn't stay in Montreal at that point. They stayed a while and then they went back.
Yeah.
So could you talk about your first months in Montreal? How easy was it for you to adapt?
Well, I lived at 7461 Upper Lachine Road. It's still there. I remember it very well. I remember being most amazed that you could fit an entire house into an apartment. And it could have bedrooms and a living room and a kitchen. I couldn't believe that. We lived right across from Elmhurst Dairy. And that was the time that Elmhurst Dairy people would go there, and they would get ice cream. And so I would sit there on the little balcony with the 2 cows, kind of looking over at me and see people go. And it was the first time I'd ever had like ice cream because my grandmother used to churn it. And I remember walking to school. I would walk from that place all the way up across the train tracks to St. Ignatius Grade School, which is right beside the church now. I mean, it's still a grade school. I think it's a school again, I'm not sure. But I remember having very cold knees because I wore knee socks. And once, for some unknown reason, the apartment building door had a big metal bar across it that you'd use to push. And I decided, how many children have done this? To stick out my tongue. So suddenly and I remember a bathtub, because we never had bathtubs in South America. We only had showers. I mean, no one would really think to lie in a tub in the tropics. It didn't really make sense. And the bathtub and ivory soap, because it floated.
And you can tell from the intensity and the vividness of Donna's descriptions what it's going to be like for you to read this book. It's just full of these wonderful sensory details. But one day, your mother wasn't very much a practicing Catholic anymore, but one day you heard her saying on the phone, "Yes, Father,
Yes.
No, Father." What's that all about?
My mother, first of all, and I only later on realized this, that I think my mother gave up on God when my father died. And so it was and I really, because our grandparents were practicing Catholics and they went to church every Sunday. They weren't overt, like they didn't, but they went to church. And so when I came to Canada and my mother never went to church, I was sure it was over. She was going to hell. There was no question about it. And I prayed a lot for her. And then one day, I heard her say this on the phone. And it was sort of like a joke. And I said, "Oh, are you talking to a priest? Are you getting married?" And then she told me, and this was really, I mean, it sounds like it should be happy, but I was really upset. She was getting married. So
Who was she getting married to?
He was a young man, interestingly enough. He was the same age my father was when he died, 25. And it turned out, of course, that he was great, but at that point, he was not great for me. I didn't want a stepfather. I read all those books. I knew what happened to stepchildren. I knew I would end up behind the stove. I would be sweeping, wearing rags. So I made her promise. I really literally did. I remember in tears making her promise that I would never, ever have to do that I would never become Cinderella. And that was it was the beginning of my life. You know, it's only in retrospect you realize, like, it's like going from the garden, you know, into a whole Canada you would not describe as a garden, you know.
Right. And so I'm going to skip a little bit because I need to keep things moving along. So the stepfather's name was Bill, and your mother, your stepfather, you and your brother moved out to Point Claire.
Yes.
And one day when you were in your early teens, you were hanging out with a friend, and something happened. And there's a paragraph I think you might want to read.
Oh, I don't know if
It's on page 6.
It is? Oh, yes, okay, in the prologue. Okay. The first clue that I was treading on shaky ground manifested in my early teens when I was recounting to a friend the story of my father's sudden death. I began to speak, sketching out the details as I had done over the years, when something shifted. My breath constricted in my chest, my voice tightened, and it dawned on me with a sickening shock. In that empty space, I once had a father, just like everyone else did. I had a father, except he was gone. I realized it, and as much as I could, being a self-centered teenager, I felt it. My father's life had ended, and we had been left to carry on without him. I struggled to turn everything into a pretty story after that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
What did you know about your father when you were a child?
Not very much. I had, luckily, my father had a photo album, which really, in a way, it's a big reason for this book. Because when my folks died, and they died 14 years ago, is it? Anyway, no, 10 years ago, 11 years ago. Sorry. It was 2014. Oh, yeah. So I inherited that photo album, and I knew the story that he had come from Europe. He was born in Monte Carlo. He came all the way to British Guyana as a French speaker, having spent the first few years of his life in Paris. And I had photographs of him, which are, some of them are in the book, that, in Paris as a little child. I knew that he had a mother, he had a sister, two sisters, and a mother who he disapproved of, who was an unusual character, a very flamboyant, I'd say, a young woman who left South America after she met Joseph Nebenzahl, my grandfather, and went to Europe with him. She was 16 years old, and proceeded in the course of those years to have one of her husbands was a dancer living in New York, a Russian dancer. So all I knew was that there was this grandmother who was incredibly beautiful and kind of wild, and I never met her because she died before he did. So
what did you learn about your father while researching and writing this book that you didn't know already?
The big piece of the story is that my father, who really ended up fatherless, I mean, that's the irony of it here. They went back to Europe and left their children in South America. So my father and his siblings and his sister were left in South America. His parents went off to Europe, and his father never came back. And so the missing link was that who was Nebenzahl? And that became a second part of this story. I mean, one part is the memory of that tropical childhood. The other part is kind of like a big research project, which became a grandfather whose name is on the Shoah Memorial in Paris, who lived in Paris in the 1940s, tried to escape through Marseille, and was taken to Auschwitz. So suddenly, this little Portuguese Catholic girl that I am became somebody else, and it was a revelation for me. I mean, the parts of the book this is the part that it's almost new to me because of finding him and finding this part of my story.
You worked with a researcher in Antwerp, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So there is a piece here around the people who came, this Buddhist saying of when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And this happened to me many times. My friend Cheryl was working with Stanley Diamond at the Holocaust Museum, and I said, I really need somebody to look for this guy, Joseph Nebenzahl. I can't find him. And Stanley Diamond said, check out Jackie Schwartz. She lives in Antwerp, and she does all this amazing research. And Jackie Schwartz became the person who found so many things about my story that I didn't know. She did, and anyway, it all kind of fell into place for me, right to the point of kind of finding my father, which is.
But you had an inkling of this before, right? Like you said that when your first child was born, and there was a notice in the Gazette that you got a phone call, right? Tell us about the phone call.
So when people don't do this anymore, but you have a child and you put a little note in the Gazette, in the paper, and it says Nebenzahl, Donna, and Swift Mark, blah blah blah, the birth of their whatever. So it happened more than once, because someone would call me up and say, my whatever's last name is Nebenzahl. Are you Nebenzahl? Do you come from Poland? Are you? And every time I would say, no, I don't know those people. I'm not that. I don't have any. I must be from another branch of Nebenzahl who ended up in South America. I mean, that's really what I thought of it. So when this kind of unfolding, when the journey kind of took me in that direction, it was quite amazing.
Yeah, yeah, it must have been. Like you said, you grew up thinking of yourself as a Portuguese Catholic from British Guiana, but that colony doesn't exist anymore. You're not a practicing Catholic, and now you know that you're only partly Portuguese. So, how was it to accept the change of identity that this discovery provoked in you? And in spite of the wisdom of Buddhism, do you wish that you'd found all this out earlier in your life?
I don't know if I could have found it out earlier. I mean, I do think that I was quite ready to learn all of this when it came time to start to write. I mean, I was always sort of I was writing the memories. I wrote the memories in my head for a long time because I wanted to, you know how when you're young and something happens and you smell something and it reminds you, or you feel a breeze on your skin and you're taken back to a moment, in your past. I had all of those. Those were like physical memories that I wanted to write about. This part of it was it's like a revelation. It's like I have another life, and I am touched by it, and I feel like it's a door that's opening here for me.
That's wonderful. You had a distinguished career as a journalist for the Gazette and elsewhere, and I'm wondering if, looking back, you would say that your career was shaped in any way by these experiences, your early life that we've been talking about, and your arrival as an immigrant in Montreal. How did that shape what you went on to become?
I feel like, when I came to Canada and when I talk to people about that experience, about coming into another country, especially as a child, you're so vulnerable. So I always felt, even though I kind of blended in, I looked like everybody else, that I was not part of. At first, of course, when I spoke, I had a West Indian accent, and so that certainly separates you. But I think it maybe made me look out at the world a little bit more. I mean, journalism is meant to be like you're an observer of what's happening, and I think that this is part of what I felt like I was always able to do. I mean, I think that's not just me. All journalists do that. You're right. We look at things and we try to put words to what those experiences are or what that is that we see. But and also the idea of being an immigrant. I grew up realizing that in a room full of people, I might have been the only immigrant, which seems unusual. I mean, I'm not that old, but no, that's not true. But the point is that an immigrant, to me, in most cases, no immigrant wants to leave home. You always carry that with you, that you're in a new place. I mean, there are some writers who observe that as that there's a chasm between your past and your future when you do something, when you leave home. So the meaning of home, I mean, getting back to the book, the meaning of home is really what this book is about.
I've really been enjoying this conversation, and I hope you people have as well. And I honestly thought, knowing that Donna can be quite eloquent and loquacious and so on, I really thought we would fill our allotted time with my questions. But I think there is going to be time for a few questions from the audience. No, I have one left. One left, Lynn. So I'm just giving people time to get their questions ready, because I'm going to ask my last question, and then there'll be time for some questions from the floor. Donna, why did you want to write this book?
Why did I want to write this book? Well, I guess because I wanted to capture it. I wanted to build a house of words. I wanted to be able to recreate, and I wanted to tell this, bring these memories to life as best I could.
And you've done that beautifully. Please thank Donna Nebenzahl.